In this lecture, we are going to compare the differences between an ASP.NET Core app and a full framework app compiling ASP.NET 4.6. So I already have my test application we created in a previous lecture. This is our ASP.NET Core app running from Visual Studio 2015. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here to my Start menu. I'm going to go to Visual Studio 2015. I'm going to create an ASP.NET 4.6 application, run an MVC. So let's go over here to File, New, and let's do Project. And I'm going to go to Visual C#, and I'm going to go to ASP.NET Web Application. I'm going to change where this is located. And I'm going to put this on my desktop in this folder. Select that folder and name it Full Framework app. Let's just name it Full Framework. Let's press OK. As you can see right here, we have all the different choices of what type of application we want. We can do an empty application, we can use web forms, MVC, Web API, and we also have our ASP.NET 5, which is ASP.NET Core down here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select an MVC app, ASP.NET 4.6. One key difference that you'll notice here is that MVC and Web API are separate in a full framework app. They are combined in ASP.NET Core to make MVC 6. So I'm going to click MVC. I'm going to change the authentication to no authentication. Press OK. I'm not going to host it in the cloud. Press OK. Give it a second while it's creating the project. And right here, we have our full framework application right here. So we're just going to go through this and look at some of the differences between a full framework app and an ASP.NET Core app. One thing to keep in mind is that Microsoft is going to support the full .NET framework. It is not going away by a long shot. So keep that in mind if you're a Windows developer and you like the full .NET framework. I just want to show you the differences between the two different frameworks. The first thing that you'll notice here is that in our full framework app, this is the project structure. This is where it gets compiled. In our ASP.NET Core app on the left, which is test, you'll see the www root. This is all the static files that are going to be rendered to the browser. These are the only files that are available to a user. If somebody tries to access a file outside of the www root, it's blocked by default. It's blacklisted. So in the www root, these are the only files that are available for the user. You could see my CSS folder, images folder. You could see my JavaScript folder with my site.js script and my libraries folder that associates for my Bower and Gulp. Over here in my full framework app, you'll notice that this is available within the project structure. There's no www root. So by default, these files are whitelisted. Of course, when you bind it in IIS, some folders and some files are not accessible. You cannot directly access this C# file. It's blocked by default. But this is where your project structure lies. It lies in its main folder. In ASP.NET Core, it's rendered in the www root, and that's the only thing that can be rendered and accessed. So any file outside of that cannot be accessed. Another thing that you'll notice is in our full framework app, we have the global.asax file. In ASP.NET Core, we do not have a global.asax file. In the global.asax file, it registers everything in our application structure. So the application start event, we are registering our bundles, our filters, a lot of different routes, registering our routes for MVC. Over here in our ASP.NET Core app, we have the startup.cs. And in the startup.cs, this is where all of our dependencies are injected. As you can see right here, we're going to go into these in subsequent lectures. We are registering our configuration in the startup. We also are adding our JSON file for our app settings. Any environmental variables that we want, we can associate that. We have our configuration services, any services that we want to add, as you can see here, MVC. And then to associate what services we are going to use, whether we're in development, whether we want an exception handler, rendering static files. So there's a dependency injection associated with what we want to use in our ASP.NET Core app, with all of these different methods being injected to the full structure of our application. In our full framework app, we do not have this built-in dependency injection. We have to build it to some extent what we want to register and associate in our application. So there's no global.asax in our ASP.NET full framework application. Another key difference you can see here is that there is no web.config associated in the main project structure. Now you'll notice that in the www root, by default in the scaffolded website, it does have a web.config. This is dependent on me running this application in IIS Express, but I do not need this web.config. The DNX runtime will associate my project. But in my main folder structure, there's no web config. In the full framework app, this is where I register all of the DLLs that I want to associate in my assembly. You see the newtonsoft.json. I have the application insights, unobtrusive JavaScript. So this is associating all my assembly references, the system.web, system.web helpers, web pages, MVC. This has all of my assemblies and my associated compilers in the web.config. Even I'll associate my app settings inside of my web.config. So this is what you need to associate in a Windows environment. In ASP.NET Core, we have a project.json. And the beautiful thing about project.json, it associates all of our dependencies inside of this JSON file. So you can see right here in the first item, I have an application insight, right? Now, the beautiful thing about this is I can change the versioning. It gives me a default version, but let's say right here, I want to change this application insight. And let's just put a different version. It has 1.0 RC1, but let's take this out. Watch this. Right when I save this, you're going to see this restore and rebuild. So when I save it, look at it. It's restoring all the packages associated inside of the dependencies of our application. In a full framework app, we have to go in, recompile, rebuild our application to associate and remove the references in our application. So we can look for the application insight DLL. We can remove this. And once we remove it, we have to recompile and find out what dependencies are associated with the application insights. Sometime in source control, it can cause a lot of issues by recompiling the app. But here, it rebuilds the app because all of these assemblies are a NuGet package. Let's go back and add that back there. Let's just reverse our position here. Let's save it. It automatically restores the packages and rebuilds all the necessary components associated with that dependency. So we have our version. We have our compilation options, emit entry point. So we want this application to emit an entry point inside of the structure, folder structure. We have all of our dependencies with ASP.NET MVC, tag helpers, orchestral web server. Similar to the references we have here, the only difference between the two is that our ASP.NET Core application utilizes NuGet packages that can be removed and added. By default, a lot of these dependencies must run inside of your full framework app to make it work. For example, the system.web must be there for the system.web abstractions, application server, dynamic data. All of these items are dependent on the system.web DLL. As you've noticed in our ASP.NET Core app, none of these are needed for any of the different dependencies we have registered in source control. Another item associated in our project.json is the commands. We have a web command that launches our orchestral web server. It locates the server URLs on HTTP localhost 5000. We have the frameworks associated in our application. We have the DNX 4.51, which is the full .NET framework, and the DNX core. I can remove the DNX 451 and it will recompile my app once I save it. And now all of my dependencies will run from the DNX core, and any errors will show up down here. I will see all of the errors associated if there's a dependency that needs the full .NET framework associated with the CLR. I can also exclude what I want in my project.json as far as the www root and the node._modules, which is associated with our reference packages to gulp and bower. And we can also associate which scripts are going to be pre-published associated with npm install, bower install, and gulp. We'll dive into these different libraries associated in our client-side development. So the two main differences we'll notice from this is the web.config, the references associated with how they're restored by default in our application compared to the full .NET Framework and an ASP.NET Core app. One other nice item here is that in a full framework app, you'll come over here and you'll say add or manage NuGet packages. And once you manage NuGet packages, everything is combined from the server side and the client side. So any NuGet packages that you want to associate, you can pull into your full framework app. The nice thing about an ASP.NET Core app is that once we have gulp, bower, and NuGet, one of the nice things about an ASP.NET Core app, it separates the server-side assembly dependencies and the client side. So as you can see right here, I right-clicked, I click Manage NuGet Packages, and NuGet packages are associated with my server-side dependencies. If I get out of that, I can right-click the application, I can click Manage Bower Packages, and my client-side scripts are separated. This is a big difference between an ASP.NET Core app and a full framework app. It's separated between client-side package builders like Bower and NuGet packages associated on the server. So this is a beautiful difference for modern web application development. Microsoft has incorporated this within its ASP.NET Core scaffolded web application. You have your app settings.json that can be associated with different configuration settings as far as if you have a connection to a SQL server or different connection strings to different databases are associated in this app settings.json, which is separate from your project.json. In full framework apps, you go to the web.config and you will find your different configuration settings associated inside of a section of configuration right here in app settings. There's a little breakdown in structure when you compare an ASP.NET Core app to a full framework application. You still have some similarities like the model views and controllers associated in both applications. You still have routing. You have bundle.config and the app start associated with your full framework app. In your ASP.NET Core app, you don't need all of those dependencies. Everything is dependency injection that's associated in your startup.cs, and all the services that you want to use from those assembly references will be injected in the configure services, like we stated before with add MVC, and then the configure to associate what you want those services to do and implement. You see our app.useMVC, and it gives our different routes associated with that. If we go over to our full framework app, it will be implemented in the route config class, which will then be utilized inside of our global.asax to give our routing in ASP.NET MVC. There's a lot of differences between a full framework app and an ASP.NET Core app. One thing I want you to keep in mind is Microsoft is not getting rid of the full framework application structure. You can still build full framework apps if you're used to it. Going forward, you will see a lot of this to be associated in our full framework apps because ASP.NET Core apps are built for optimization. They start with the bare minimum of assembly dependencies for performance, and then you can build up from what you actually need to use and inject into your application. So in the subsequent lectures, we will actually start delving into the different items in our ASP.NET Core application related to our startup.cs and our different items in the project.json. And then understanding the project structure is very important going forward when we start building an application. I want to thank you for joining me in this lecture. Have a nice day.